Welcome to conjuredcraft. My name is Taryn, and this week we're playing Bone Game. A few months ago, I went to Adepticon for the first time. And while I was there, a group of us visited the Milwaukee Public Museum. The first floor of the museum is gorgeous. We were surrounded by fossils, artistic renderings, and specimens inside of antique wood and glass cases. I was particularly drawn to the skull specimens. While looking them over, I wondered, what if 4 different artists were given the same skull? How would they each interpret it? How different could the results be? So I grabbed my favorite monster makers, Nick, Tina, and Alfred, and we discussed where to begin. Choosing just one was a challenge in itself, because there are some spectacular skulls out there. The hippopotamus genuinely looks like it belongs to a science fiction predator. Elephants are like Cyclops out of epic tales of fiction. The platypus looks more like an insect with mandibles, giraffes have built-in demon horns, and the dugong is actually just nightmare fuel if you think about it for too long. I suggested the humble tapir for a few reasons. Its skull doesn't have an outwardly aggressive appearance, but still has rows of teeth. It's similar in shape language to other mammalia, but it still has a very unique design. And of course, I was really enticed by its nasal bone. Everyone was happy to work off of this skull, and it probably didn't hurt that I already had a 3D model lined up. You can generally find scans of all kinds of skeletons online, but I'll include a link below if you want this specific one. With that, I reached out to my friend Kira to get the skull 3D printed while I started working on some designs. If you're up to date on the deep conjuredcraft lore, then you know I've been talking about making creatures for years. It's one of the reasons I started creating art, and it's been the main focus of my hobby for quite some time. And it's because of that passion that as an adult, I have become quite the admirer of paleontology, speculative physiology, and, of course, cryptozoology. I want to combine all of these interests and apply them to my concept art, taking time and care to really think about the anatomy of this animal, but while still having some fun. The best place to start was studies of the tapir skull. I drew these over and over to make sure that I understood the assignment, and even with that, I still managed to come up with some creatures with their eyes completely in the wrong spot. I briefly played with the idea of altering the skull, increasing the cranium, shortening the jaw, and even giving it tusks. But this starts to pull away from the original design brief. I have sketches where I kept it as a mammal, others where I pushed it into a more avian direction, but eventually I had to rein myself in. A quick note: despite making art publicly for 5 years now, I'm not immune to the anxiety of my work not looking good enough. That feeling of having other people look at your illustrations, your sculptures, whatever it may be, and they still don't match up to where you want them to be, that's really frustrating. But it's also a good thing. Hear me out. That feeling, that uneasiness, that means you know your work can be better. And as long as you keep practicing and work with that feeling instead of trying to just fight against it or hide from it, your work will get better. So when I accepted that uneasiness, I finally landed on a more reptilian creature. This was largely influenced by the vocal sac in this creature on this piece of art by Iris Compiet. It reminded me of dewlaps on Anole lizards, one of the many invasive reptiles to my hometown in Florida. To lean a little bit more into the weird and strange, I wanted the nose to stop rather abruptly, giving it a fleshy snout like a wild boar. I also did some iterations where it had a hen's comb. Maybe this can be an example of sexual dimorphism within the species. The head is always the most challenging part to nail down, which is why I wanted to get into it first. In the past, I've always said that you need guide rails when creating creatures, and because my only design brief right now is that I'm using the same skull as my friends, it's very open to interpretation. For the build, I'm going to give myself one additional challenge, and that is that I am making a specimen for Monstra Obscura. But I'll tell you more about that later. If you were expecting something in 28mm scale, I'm really sorry to disappoint. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to make at the start of this, so I actually had 2 skulls printed up, being a little optimistic that I would get to make an even larger creature. Now that I have them in front of me, I think we'll save the bigger one for something else, and just use the smaller skull, for the sake of my sanity. The main alteration I want to do is replace its teeth. Regardless of whether or not they're visible in the final product, this is a level of detail I'd hope to see in a display, so I'm going to chop those off and replace them with this translucent clay that I bought way too much of last year. I'm pushing the clay into the 3D print where the teeth used to be, and getting a rough idea of the size and shape. This clay doesn't stick to other objects very well, so I put each tooth's worth of clay onto a baking sheet so I can refine the details off of the sculpture. Then, once I've baked the clay, I carve them down even more with my hobby knife. This way I have some perfect dentures before gluing them back onto the skull, which is just as fiddly as it looks here. I do love the final look of this clay once it's cured, and I'm really hopeful that it will be worth the effort by the end of this craft. To build up the musculature and soft tissue anatomy, I'm just going to use air dry clay. This stuff has been sitting in my craft supplies for a little while now, and it needs some persuasion to become workable again. Air dry clays sometimes have natural fibers or paper pulp inside of them, which means that it's kind of tricky to carve and shape it when it's still wet. I've found that my preferred way to work with this medium is to get the rough shape that I'm after and then come back and refine it after it's dried. This also allows me to go for speed over precision, so I'm dabbing some glue onto each piece of clay to make sure that it bonds nicely to both the 3D print and itself. There's going to be an additional skin layer on top of all of the clay, so I'm not too worried about the details. After a night in the hot water cupboard to get it good and dry, I come back with my hobby knives and sandpaper to refine the muscles. Then I can add on another layer of clay, wait for that to dry, and refine it even more. But instead of filming that process over and over, let's have a look at the rest of the creature design. For the body, I knew I wanted to continue that push into paleontology, and this mutant bird artwork reminded me of Scansoriopteryx. This is a Maniraptoran dinosaur with absolutely crazy forearms that are out of proportion to the rest of its body. Long appendages like this could be used for locomotion, mating displays, but most likely for feeding. And given that my creature has both low crown teeth and molars, one could look at the skeleton and reasonably speculate that it has an omnivorous diet. This is that speculative physiology I was talking about that adds a unique layer to the concept. This is also, however, where conventional zoology goes right out the window. Another primary source of inspiration for this craft are cutaway illustrations of the embryo development of birds, lizards, and fine, more dinosaurs. Look, if I can be honest, I am a product of the 90s. Jurassic Park has had me in a chokehold since my 5th birthday. In fact, I'm willing to bet, based on the demographics of my channel, that if I were to ask you what your favorite dinosaur is, you'd have one ready to write in the comments down below. Anyway, since we're leaning into nostalgia and strange anatomy, I definitely think this creature is oviparous. It's born from an egg. To keep it unique and in that realm of cryptozoology, I've resisted the temptation of giving it a tail, which I personally think makes it look even more endearing in this curled up fetal position. This is easily the most time I've spent in my sketchbook for a project on the channel, and before we get to the final art, let's build out the skeleton. You can make anything out of kitchen foil. It's cheap, light, and can be sculpted into any shape, which is great for me since I have to make so many vertebrae over and over and over again. Once I had most of the spine finished, I got really excited and started to thread it onto some armature wire, forming a shiny, cursed friendship bracelet. The skeleton continues to go on like this. A mixture of cardboard and wire to make an armature, hot glue and foil to bulk out those shapes. It's really a once you've seen it once, you can figure out the rest situation. So while I continue to build the skeleton, I want to use this time to talk to you about museums. Did you know the first public museum in the world was built over 2,000 years ago? It was created by Enegaldi Nana, princess, high priestess, and curator. This is to say, museums are a very old idea, and I believe at their core, a pure one. In almost every city in the world is a building that houses history, science, art, and culture. Some of it is local, much of it is global, and it's on exhibition for anyone to come and see, most of the time for free. And to be clear, I'm not saying they are perfect. There is a legacy of colonization that cannot be ignored, reparations that are long overdue, and a history of theft that is attached to many of these buildings. What I am saying, though, is that when they're done right, I believe they can be the most inspiring places in the world. There is a spectacle to them, especially the big ones. They are full of objects you didn't even know you needed to see, artwork that makes you feel something, interactive displays that stimulate your senses, artifacts that connect you to a time before you were even you. And if you're really lucky, you find a special item, a curiosity that's been frozen in time, a memento that makes you feel all of the weight of human history until it fills your mind and your chest so that all you can do is look at this thing in front of you and just say, whoa. I think it's safe to say I love visiting museums. So much so that I started making my own. It's called the Museum of Monstra Obscura. Here are the cliff notes. In another time and another place, a secret order was formed to catalog otherworldly creatures. An eclectic group of researchers and field experts work together to contain the more deadly threats, but overall maintain an archive that over the years they casually began to refer to as the museum. This is a work of fiction, a location setting that I've been writing on and off for some time, and for a while, it just hasn't clicked. Something has always been off, and I recently worked out what that was. I forgot that the most important part about this hobby, about making art, it is so much more fun with other people. So I've restarted development on this setting with my coven members. And I've been waiting for an opportunity to build a prop from the world until I could do it with friends. Consistently, I have made my best work with other people, and I know that in the spirit of collaboration, Monstra Obscura will be one of my best projects to date. You can subscribe to the channel, follow me on Instagram, or bookmark my website conjuredcraft.com if you want to stay up to date. Additionally, if you want to help shape the world, consider joining the Coven. Now that you know I'm making a specimen for a museum, the posing and skeletal nature of this creature should make a little more sense, as does the finishing material. Papier-Mâché is an old craft and time-honored tradition on this channel. I've been using it since my very early days on this platform with making monstrous miniatures, and more recently on my Turnip 28 army. Considering that humans have practiced this art since the 15th century, there are a lot of tutorials that you can find online, and everyone has their own recipe. So I'm just going to cover what I think are helpful tips. Firstly, your ingredients. Glue, water, and tissue paper is all you need. You can optionally add some cheap wall filler for added structure and texture. Generally, I want more glue than anything else for sticking paper down quickly, but adding more wall filler is good if you need to correct some large gaps. You definitely want to get a bowl to mix everything up in, and it just makes it easier to quickly dip your paper. Using a chip brush, you can tap the paper down to help it stick, and also give it a little bit of texture. This keeps your fingers relatively clean so you can keep working quickly. Something I'm particularly proud of was that I had the foresight to make the first layer with black paper and black paint. Not only is this going to cover up the foil really nicely, I can now see any spots that I've missed. If you don't have a particularly colored tissue paper, just add whatever color paint you want it to be to the mixture. Once all the foil was covered to the best of my ability, I switch over to using white paper with some white paint. Again, so I can differentiate between each layer and get really good coverage. When that top coat totally dries, I go back with sandpaper to knock back any really high spots and even out the parts that look very obviously like strips of paper. My last wet mix has way more wall filler in it, so I can dunk the soft tissue paper into the bowl and ball it up into a paper clay. This gives me some varied texture across the specimen, but it's also a great time to reinforce any structural points. Once it's all dried, you're going to be pretty surprised at just how strong paper, glue, and wall filler can be. The last tip is to just embrace the mess. Literally, it can get quite messy, and that's why my old cutting mat is back out on the table. But also, there's only so much you can control with these materials. Give each layer overnight in a warm place to dry properly. Work on sections that are facing up. Don't try to fight gravity. And if you're really lucky, like me, you'll decide to do all of this in the middle of yet another heat wave. I may be living in a furnace, but at least my arts and crafts are dry. Now that our monster is set aside to dry out completely, I can finally show you the box it's going to live in. I found this cheaply made, mass-produced wall clock at my local thrift, confirmed that the electronics were rotted beyond my skill level, and eagerly brought it home to collect some dust until the summer. I knew that whatever I used this for, it was going to be a massive project and I would need a little bit of extra time. Thankfully, the disassembly was pretty straightforward, and I was left with some interesting bits to use in future projects. To improve the final display, I cut down a sheet of MDF to close up the back of the box, and purchased some lovely red suede to line it with. My very sharp and very powerful fabric scissors are back in Aotearoa, and the craft scissors I currently own were not cutting it, so my thread snippers stepped in to get the job done. Then with some glue and a few heavy boxes, the backing board was all sorted. There was still one small issue, which is this structural board here. It's very obvious now that the clock face has been removed, but I used some scrap paper and cut and measured a stencil that would fill this gap. I transferred that stencil onto some more MDF for structure, and then onto more of that red suede as the finishing material. While I don't particularly love this detail, it would have been far more work to try to remove that unsightly board, and I'm not confident the box would hold its shape without it. Hopefully, I'll come up with something clever to put in this space before the end of the video. When I made the decision to make a mummified specimen, I had a very specific image in mind. One of the two Inca burial sites that were not destroyed by Spanish conquistadores is El Laguna de los Condores. This is an archaeological site in Peru that contains thousands of mummies. Unfortunately, there is also a sad history tied to this site. During the 90s, it was badly looted by thieves, and in the time since, tourists have caused further damage by taking artifacts as souvenirs, and even going so far as to move the remains for photographs. Because of this, I'm not going to be showing you any photos of these ancient people. But I will, however, encourage you to read more about this incredible site and the work of Dr. Sonia Guillen, Peru's leading expert on mummies. Links down below. With my reference images pulled up, I knew that to get the look I was after, I had to start with a very warm base coat. So I have yellow, black, and red paint on my palette. It starts off very yellow, but I'll be knocking most of this back later with some dry brushing, and then adding on a series of washes until I get a tone that's somewhere between mummified remains and freshly dug up corpse. To add to that effect, once I go over all the paint with a matte varnish, I'm then going to lightly dust it using baby powder. This will knock back any of those glossy high points, but also add a little bit of aging and weathering to the final piece. With the painting and finishing more or less covered, let's dig into some lore. From the Journal of Jonathan Thomas Kerrigan. This work was not always a scientific venture. Academia is now a luxury for those of us that stay behind. Am I so aged that I freely pass judgment from the safety of my study, especially on a foundational member from so long ago? Perhaps I have forgotten the fear, risking life and limb, facing countless unknown threats. Claws in that green-black smoke. The Lacerta Yamia, so named after its discoverer. Specimen was recovered from a former outpost that was abdicated, where it was transferred to the archives, or the museum, as the others have begun to call it. It appears that it was mislabeled and very nearly disposed of, and as a result, I cannot help but wonder, had it been discovered sooner, would the results be any different? My study of the remains confirms the field report it was delivered with. Despite the markers that would lead a naturalist to identify a mammal, The physiology is more in line with other reptilia encountered. The smaller cranium points to this creature being a female, with a high probability that it was fully grown, if not at the end of adolescence. From the first-hand account, it would appear that its claws were powerful enough to lacerate flesh, making researchers at the time inclined to believe it was strictly a predator. There is, however, a much more reasonable explication for the enlarged unguis. These would aid the creature to climb trees or similar structures in search of food. That, and given the unique denticula, it subsisted on an omnivorous diet. Based on kindred monstra, I believe it had superb visual acuity, which is likely why it startled former researcher Yamiya, despite its diminutive stature. Please note, given the state of the remains, some of these conclusions are speculative. Addendum. After some careful consideration and a review of the museum records, there is one other observation that I must mark. This creature, to the best of my forensic knowledge, was taken alive. Based on the fetal position the corpse has withered, it was likely kept in the same crate I discovered it within, where I can only surmise it was left to starve and die. Upon further examination, there is damage to the left orbit, where I believe a pre-mortem enucleation occurred. And while it is not my place to denigrate former researchers, I can find no other record of this species, which means, however slight, there exists the possibility that she was the last of her kind. It is my responsibility to set academic standards and to uphold medical civility for our order. I have interred the specimen into a more fitting reliquary. This is to hold us all to account. We shall seek out monsters, not become them. Finally, I am renaming this specimen Papiosaurus. Saurus, as until further evidence can be provided, for an extinct species. Papio, from the Latin, to whimper. Thank you for joining me on this journey into speculative zoology. I hope some of you found this video entertaining, even if you don't plan on making a full-scale museum specimen. Also, I hope you consider papier-mâché for your next hobby project. You could use it to make large-scale terrain, reinforce your already existing gaming boards, and if you just copy my project quite literally, then you could have an epic dragon or dead god or some other massive creature at your next gaming encounter. If you haven't already, please watch, like, and subscribe to my friends' channels. Besides the incredible work each of them did with their skulls, Nick is embarking on creating the fantastical world of Goblands, Alfred is embroiled in a rich world-building project called Heroes of the Ravaged Gardens, and Tina is completely entranced in the forgotten fairy tales of the Hazelands. These are all incredible artists, world builders, and storytellers, so please check them out, all links listed down below. If you would like to support me and get this massive world-building project off the ground, subscribe to the channel, consider picking up some merch, or join our coven on conjuredcraft.com. Thank you so much for watching this video. I am so happy you're here. Until next time, I'll see you soon.